Good evening, everyone. We are about to get started. We're very happy to be with you this evening. My name is Catherine Stevenson, and I'm the Superintendent of Education at the Durham Catholic District School Board. I'm responsible for faith formation, equity, and Indigenous education. This is our second in the series, sponsored in partnership with Regis St. Michael's College. This is an area that's near and dear to my heart. I am a St. Michael's grad and began my theological studies with a Master of Religious Education and didn't feel I was quite done, as is the case when you study theology at St. Michael's at the University of Toronto. It is quite addictive, so that that basic degree became an advanced degree, a Master of Arts in Theology with a specialization in eco-theology. So I was delighted when we were offered this opportunity to host this evening. Very, very important conversations and a real example of how our faith increases our understanding of the natural world, and that science and theology are compatible. And these are important conversations that we need to have with our young people, to show how faith infuses everything that we do, and that we are called to weigh into this critical time and to have our faith inform how we move forward. So we here in the Durham region always begin by acknowledging the land upon which we are presenting. We are in Oshawa this evening, but these are Indigenous lands long before settlers arrived. So I would invite Janice Thurston Goodwin, our consultant for religious education, to come up and offer our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Catherine. Let's move here. So we'll begin in a good way by starting with our land acknowledgement in Anishinaabe-Moan, which is the traditional languages of the lands on which we are situated right now.
Meanwhile, the Canadamen Oman Durham region, the Vancouver Gilmichistagi of Skilgog Island, Ileke Oman Ya Yang.
So we here in the Durham region respectfully acknowledge that we're in the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of Skugog Island. So each time we gather, especially in an educational setting, it is important to begin by reflecting and connecting to the land acknowledgement. If we don't, it's mere words and recitation. But a land acknowledgement is a recognition that we are all treaty peoples, and it is relational. It isn't to say that it is between people, those who came and those who were here from time immemorial. Rather, it's a promise with all of creation. Nigon Sinclair, who just last week supported our students in their learning around treaties, has written in his column that territorial acknowledgements are seeds, opportunities for truth-telling, growth, and action. They require us to plant, nurture, and care for them, so we must take seriously the responsibilities they require of us. In short, land acknowledgements without actions are just unfulfilled words. Our young students, who unfortunately have had the most climate anxiety, are more aware and willing when it comes to that actionable piece of land acknowledgements. But all of us need to grow those seeds, meaning we need to reflect each time a land acknowledgement is stated on what specific actions we can take starting right now. In this way, relationships in the land are honored and cultivated, and the earth is in a better way after we leave it than when we inhabit it. And I'll turn it over to Cindy.
Thank you, Janice. So my name is Cindy Cameron, and I am Assistant Professor of Religious Education at Regis St. Michael's at the University of St. Michael's College. And with my colleagues, Hilda and Rosemary, we are the coordinators of this event. And I would like to invite you all to join me in an opening prayer. So let us pray. Heavenly God, we thank you for gathering us today, both in person and online, to think together about the students we encounter each day. Holy God, we find ourselves in a grievous position on a warming planet, wildfires burning, ice caps melting, soil degrading, water poisoning. We have failed to act to protect your creation, and we are reaping the rewards of our inaction. We are sorrowful for the ways we have harmed our home with our excesses and apathies, our neglect of the needs of the poorest and least powerful, and our disregard for ecosystems. Help us today to walk with young people in their and our grief and dread. Empower us to do what we must through your Holy Spirit, who teaches us and inspires us to the good work of wholeness and justice. We ask this in the name of Jesus, your Son and our brother. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to invite Hilda Koster to come up and MC the rest of our evening.
Good evening and welcome to this afternoon's workshop on critical conversations in Catholic education, climate and eco-social resilience. A special welcome to everyone who is joining us online this afternoon. We are glad you're here, and thank you to Catherine Stevenson and the Durham Catholic District School Board for hosting today's event. My name is Hilda Koster, and I'm an associate professor in ecological theology at the Regis St. Michael's Faculty of Theology, where I also direct the Elliott Allen Institute in Theology and Ecology. And together with Cindy and with Rosemary, I'm directing the Critical Conversation project. The workshop today is the second workshop organized by our project on climate anxiety and climate fear in youth. There is a growing body of literature on this topic by educational experts and developmental psychologists. On your tables, you will find a handout, a guide on climate emotions, on emotions in teaching climate change. And you are invited to take one. And in the back, you will see a blank page, and you can use that for note-taking today. We want you to take notes. At least we want to give the opportunity to take notes. So our work in this project is very much informed by all these resources. But we have a particular interest in the project, and that particular interest is that we want to see how our faith traditions, and in particular the Catholic tradition, might help us address the existential dread caused by climate change, and how it might help us to nurture eco-social resilience. Thus our first workshop, which was co-hosted by the Halton and Durham Peel School Board this past February, looked at Catholic social teaching and Laudato Si. The topic for today's workshop is science, suffering, and eco-theology. Dr. Adam Hincks will address the relationship between faith and science within the Catholic tradition, asking how we may integrate questions of purpose and meaning in teaching science, and particularly climate science. And our second speaker, Dr. Jean-Pierre Fortin, will be offering theological insights on suffering and grace, drawing especially on the biblical tradition of lament. These slightly more academic presentations are followed by a presentation by Sister Marianne Francalanza, who will offer eco-theological resources for teaching climate change, drawing in part on her own experience as a secondary school teacher in the United Kingdom. Through it all, we hope to hear also from you, the audience here in the room and also our audience online. Even though we will be doing a lot of talking today, we really mean this to be a conversation. And so we are offering our insights, but we are very much interested in learning from you and what has worked in your classroom. So the first part of the workshop this afternoon Dr. Hincks and Dr. Fortin will speak. And you are invited to ask questions and offer observations after they both have spoken. And in the second part of the workshop, Sister Mary Ann will be offering a more interactive presentation. So then, without further ado, let me introduce our first two speakers. Dr. Adam Hincks is the Assistant Professor and Sutton Family Chair in Science, Christianity and Cultures in the David Dunlop Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics and in the Christianity Culture Program at the University of St. Michael's College. He's also an adjunct scholar of the Vatican Observatory. Dr. Hincks' primary research interest is physical cosmology, or the empirical study of the universe as a whole. He helps to create and run observatories that make maps of the sky at radio wavelengths and specializes in analyzing the resulting data to obtain cosmological and astrophysical information. Professor Hincks also is a Jesuit priest and has a background in philosophy and theology and contributes to the study of the relationship between physical theory and the Christian faith, with a particular focus on the notion of creation. Dr. Jean-Pierre Fortin is the Associate Professor of Practical Theology in the Regis St. Michael's Faculty of Theology. Dr. Fortin holds a PhD in Systematic Theology from the University of St. Michael's College and a PhD in Philosophy from Université Laval and a licentiate in Sacred Theology from Regis College. At Regis St. Mike's, Dr. Fortin serves as the Director of Field Education and Pastoral Formation. In his teaching and research, he is particularly interested in the spiritual formation of the human person through the processing of traumatic events and experiences. Dr. Fortin published the book Grace in Auschwitz, a Holocaust Christology in 2016, and has a forthcoming book, Evolving Grace, Spiritual History of a Christian Doctrine. Dr. Hincks will speak first, followed by Dr. Fortin. Please help me welcome Dr. Hincks.
I was asked to speak about science and faith to provide kind of a background or a context for the topic of today. So I thought what I'd do is do that quite generally, actually, to give us, as I said, a context. I'll touch on ecology at the end. Right, so you're probably familiar with this, but I think today, at least in the West, most people have a view of science and faith as conflictual, right? So this notion that over time, science has been progressing, and as it progresses, it comes up with things that conflict with what religion says, and it kind of pushes religion progressively out of the picture. That's kind of the narrative that we're used to. And as I'm sure you're aware, many of our young people, and many of us, frankly, have that kind of worldview in our minds. Often when people ask me about science and faith, because I'm a priest who's also a scientist, they'll often ask me, how do you reconcile faith and science? That's typically how people pose the question. And what's kind of revealing about that is you only ask about reconciliation if there's a conflict, right? So there's an implicit assumption there that kind of science is butting up against religion, and we have to do something to kind of fix a problem, right? What's interesting is that this view of conflict is pretty young when it comes to the history of thought. Right? So you can find the roots of this notion that over history, science and religion have been butting heads. That narrative really comes from the 19th century. And there, at least in the Anglosphere, there were a couple of books that were very influential in disseminating this view. The one here on the left, The Conflict of Religion and Science by John Draper. There was another book called The History of the Warfare of Science and Technology by Andrew White. These were kind of bestsellers, and they kind of promoted this view that over history there have been these series of irreconcilable conflicts between faith and science. Now, no one reads these books anymore. I've never read them myself. I've only read about them. But they're still very much with us in the zeitgeist. As I hinted, though, this isn't how Christian thinkers have thought about science and faith throughout most of history and still today. So just to give one example, you can go back over 1,500 years to find an example that doesn't look at it this way. St. Augustine suggests when we read scripture, for example, that the best way to do that, or one of the ways to do that rather, is to take the best science that we have and consider that in our reading of scripture rather than seeing them as telling two separate stories. So one could talk a lot about what St. Augustine said, but I just wanted to give a simple example. So how ought we to think about the faith-science relationship? Ian Barber, whose book I have up here on the screen, was a scholar of science and religion. He died a few years ago. But one thing he did was try and figure out, well, what's the terrain? What are the possible ways that science and religion can be related? And how have people tried to relate science and religion? And he came up with a pretty simple classification to cover the different options. The first one is conflict, and that's what I was just talking about, where it's kind of either or. Where you have to kind of choose between the two or kind of live this weird kind of schizophrenic existence with both of them. The second he calls independence, and this is also out there in the culture. So independence says, you know, that science asks certain questions and it has its own methodologies, and religion asks other questions and it has its methodologies, but the two are independent of each other. So they don't really have anything to do with each other. If you've heard of Stephen Jay Gould, he came up with this famous phrase, non-overlapping magisteria. So, and I see people nodding, NOMA for short. So science is one teacher, one magisterium. Religion is another teacher, another magisterium, but they're non-overlapping. So that's independence. The third model he proposes is dialogue. So in dialogue, science has its own methodology and its own questions. The religion has its own methodology and its own questions, but they're not, they can talk to each other. So there can be a dialogue between them. So for example, and I think Hilda touched on this earlier, you know, scientists, when they're doing science, they might look to religion for values, for instance, or for guidance on what the important questions are. When you're asking scientific questions, what's your scale of values? That might be an example where there could be a dialogue with religion. And then religion, on the other hand, might want to be up to date on the latest science. So Laudato Si, that I'll talk about briefly at the end, is a great example of that. So that's dialogue. And then the final position that he identifies is called integration. And the difference here is that those who hold kind of an integration view would say, no, science and religion don't really ask different questions, and they shouldn't really have different methodologies. They are overlapping, and religious questions are scientific, and scientific questions are religious. And as we move forward, we should be, you know, trying to line the two up and integrate them, as the name suggests. So the question is, well, you know, as Catholics, as Christians, what's the best way to think about this relation? And when I look at the tradition, at least in my view, it seems like the dialogue model is the one that prevails. Now, the Catholic tradition is long and involves lots of people, and it's rich. So that's why I say on my reading, because people might disagree with that, or there might be different points of view. But I think the dialogue rings true to kind of the mainstream tradition within the Catholic faith. And one place where you can see this is in the Vatican Councils. So the First Vatican Council is in the 19th century. Remember, the 19th century is when this warfare idea between science and faith starts emerging. I don't know if you've heard the term scientism. So scientism is the idea that science can answer all questions eventually. And as science progresses, we don't need religion anymore. We don't need other disciplines anymore, because science can start pushing them out as it answers more and more questions. So this is a doctrine that's kind of rising in the 19th century that the church was obviously concerned with. And then kind of on the other extreme, you have other people saying that faith shouldn't have anything to do with reason, right? So that faith should be a purely personal matter that doesn't involve reason, that involves emotion and conviction and so on. Technically, that's called fideism, right? So on the one hand, you have fideism saying, trying to divorce, religion from reason. On the other hand, you have science saying science should be explaining everything. And the church says no to both of those extremes and charts a middle course. So what did the First Vatican Council say? And this was all reiterated in the Second Vatican Council in the 60s. Well, it stressed that faith and reason are complementary, that in the Christian life, you need both faith and reason. Also pointed out that in principle, it's impossible for science and faith to conflict with each other, right? So, I mean, there might be instances where it seems as though they conflict, but the church would say, well, no, that's because we haven't looked at the problem enough, right? So obviously scientists can be mistaken in their results. Obviously theologians can make mistakes in their theology, but there's kind of this optimism here that if we work things through, we will find a compatibility between what science and what religion say. So just a couple of quotes. The first one there from Vatican II, or from Vatican I rather, about the mutual support between faith and reason. And the second one just kind of highlighting that point I was making, right? So it says, if methodological investigation within every branch of learning is carried out in a genuinely scientific manner and in accord with moral norms, it never truly conflicts with faith, for earthly matters and the concerns of faith derive from the same God. So that's kind of the principle, right? If God is the creator, then obviously the results of science are going to align, or they're going to be harmonious with revealed faith. Another thing that these councils said that's also super important was they acknowledged the autonomy of the sciences. So basically, if a scientist is following the scientific method and doing her or his job well, then it's not the job of theologians to tell them what they should be doing, right? Scientists are free to go about their scientific research, and the church respects that. So long as they're, doing science and not saying they're doing science, but actually doing theology or doing philosophy and kind of going outside of their competence. And this is kind of the warning, and here expressed by Vatican II, of kind of science going beyond its own competency, right? So it says, many unduly transgressing the limits of the positive sciences contend that everything can be explained by this kind of scientific reasoning alone, or by contrast, they altogether disallow that there is any absolute truth. So this is kind of describing what I called scientism earlier. Okay, so I'll just spend the last couple of minutes on ecology by highlighting how you can really see this dialogue model, I think, in Laudato Si. So I'm sure everyone here knows of Laudato Si, the great encyclical that Francis wrote 9 years ago. But if you look at Laudato Si, you see, well, dialogue is everywhere, first of all, in this encyclical. So I went and counted, the word dialogue appears 25 times. And if you go to chapter 5, which is kind of laying out how we ought to respond to ecological challenges, every heading in that chapter has the word dialogue in it. So it's proposing dialogue, within politics, between people, and then one of those dialogues is between religion and faith. And then in the very way it's kind of written, if you're familiar with the document, the whole first chapter is scientific results. So it kind of leads with the science, and it lays out the mainstream science about climate change, about biodiversity, and so on. So it really leads with the science, and with science that's fairly non-controversial, like it's trying to be mainstream in the presentation just to get all the facts out there. But then it doesn't stop with the science, right? And in fact, Francis kind of warns us against a purely technocratic solution. So we definitely need scientific ideas. We definitely need, engineering solutions, but we can't reduce the response simply to technocratic to a technocratic approach. Yeah, so here's this is a quote about the dialogue that needs to occur. They have distinctive approaches to understanding reality, and they can enter into an intense dialogue fruitful for both. And then finally, I think one thing Francis here is doing is also proposing the Christian faith as a framing for thinking about ecology and the challenges that we face in light of our faith. What's the Christian response? How ought we to respond to this? And I'll just finish with this suggestion that he makes. Any technical solution which science claims to offer will be powerless. He's not saying that technical solutions are bad. I think he's inviting technical solutions, and we definitely need those. But they'll be powerless to solve the serious problems of our world if humanity loses its compass, if we lose sight of the great motivations which make it possible for us to live in harmony, to make sacrifices, and to treat others well. Believers themselves must constantly feel challenged to live in a way consonant with their faith and not to contradict it with their actions. And I think to do that well, there needs to be that dialogue with the facts that science provides us. And then the question for our faith is, how do we take those facts and responsibly respond to them? So I'll finish there. Very happy to enter into dialogue during the question period, but I'll turn it over to Jean-Pierre.
Thank you.
So within that context, we can then try to think a little bit about how we are impacted by the damage that humankind has caused or induced to creation, or in creation and as part of creation. There we go. So if we think about eco-anxiety, we look at a number of expressions or forms it takes. And we can think in terms of a chronic fear. What are we afraid about when we speak of eco-anxiety? Environmental doom, like the impossibility or inability to foresee a positive future within creation, as part of creation, within the world as we know it, the natural world as we know it. This sense of ontological insecurity, meaning it's an insecurity that's so deep that it's based within the very being of who we are. Like as something has been fragilized within who we are made to be or were created to be, as if there's a fragmentation or something that we can't quite put together as, you know, a stable basis and foundation on which to stand and from which to move forward, whatever moving forward means, because that can also be problematic, of course. So there's a sense of jeopardizing the safety of inhabiting this world. Think about always feeling under threat, more or less direct. You're always watching for what's coming at you, instead of enjoying being present within the world you lived in. It comes to a place where you feel homesick even while you're at home, right? When home is no longer a home because it's unhealthy. It's like you can no longer grow roots because there's no healthy soil to grow roots in, or because you've turned yourself into something else than a plant that's able to grow roots. So if you're uprooted and unable to grow roots, how could you stay firm and stable and grow from in a given place? If the soil is unhealthy, what can you do to grow? So how do we create that awareness, responsible awareness to the problematic situation we find ourselves in without losing our potentiality for being able to stabilize ourselves, find a healthy place where we can settle and then grow roots? Because that's a characteristic of the Western extractivist culture, is that in order to exploit nature as a resource, you cannot settle there and make it your home, because it would mean that you destroy your own home in order to to be able to sell the goods. You turn your home into a thing, an object that you can then commodify. So the problem may be that we never, as Westerners, actually grow roots. How do we learn to do that in the first place? So it might not be that we inhabit the world in unhealthy ways, but that we never actually get to inhabit it. What does it mean to inhabit the world? And could it be that we actually experience eco-anxiety and grief because we never learned to inhabit in the first place? We speak about a chronic fear of environmental. Wait, let's see if I can get the. Okay, that creates a tension and a paradox. Because in one sense, we are eager, and young generation experiences that very quickly, very strongly or powerfully. There's an eagerness to change the situation we find ourselves in, and to transform humanity and humankind and its relationship to nature. But at the same time, and on the opposite, movement of the pendulum, there's also a sense of being overwhelmed by the extent and the depth of the crisis we find ourselves in. So how do you bring the two together? That strong impulse to do something, to be positively constructive, while at the same time you feel crushed by the task that you're confronted with. 2 points that are really interesting observation made by Britt Ray in her book, Generation Dread. The first thing is that our powerlessness is unproven. We've never really failed, she says, because we've never really tried to do something about the ecological crisis. What would happen if we, for once, tried something? Could we muster the courage to finally get going? Why do we fall back on the position of thinking that we cannot do things, that we're powerless? That judgment presupposes that we actually tried. But what if we never did? Why bear that judgment then? And the following correlate is to say that our so-called helplessness is actually acquired. It's not inbuilt, it's not natural. We trained ourselves into thinking that we can't do anything. As the Dorothee Sölle, the great German theologian, says, hopelessness is the luxury of the privileged. If you can sit around in your hopelessness because you have the ability and the comfort and the security to do so, if you are actually living in such a critical situation, you'll be forced to move because otherwise you won't be able to survive, literally. And that's the case of billions of people on it. What if we started to just mobilize our energies and awareness about the fact that, hey, our helplessness may be something we can work on in the first place? Going back to scripture, already there are very powerful insights into the relationship that human beings ought to entertain with nature. In Romans, Paul says, chapter 1, verse 18, what can be known about God is plain. That's very interesting. He speaks about knowing God, but then he goes on to talk about creation. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Very interesting. How do you get to know God? By looking at what God makes. And so you need to pay respect to what God created. That's very basic. If we disrespect creation, we disrespect God and prevent ourselves from getting to know God. Why would we ever want to do that in the first place? More than that, Paul goes on later in the same epistle to say that the entirety of creation is actually undergoing a specific journeying, transformative experience. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor, he says, labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. Very interesting here thing here is to say that creation is a dynamic reality. It's evolving, it's journeying, it's called to be more than what it's already at this point. So why would we embrace a fatalistic outlook, saying that we've reached a definitive, stable, invincible, point, while creation is always being transformed and in movement, and ourselves as well? Why not join in the movement that creation already is engaged in? Now, if we move into the experience of suffering, what's really important is to discover that it's a multi-layer, multi-dimensional experience. And we're all aware of the physical dimension of pain and suffering, the toothache that prevents you from thinking about anything else than what's going on in your mouth at that time, right? But there are also mental and psychological dimensions. When the disorder, the illness or disability or trauma reach the very fabric of your inner identity, your psychological constitution, there are the ethical and moral dimensions to it. Like, what does it mean to be a good person? And how can we live with ourselves when we feel ashamed of who we are, or what we have made or done to the world? How do we carry the burden of guilt for being ourselves and what we have done, or respond to the injustice and violence that we see being inflicted by ourselves, by others, to ourselves, to others every single day? And then finally, the spiritual dimension of suffering. When suffering reaches a depth or a scope that is such that we have to invoke the transcendent to be able to speak about it. Right? There's a point in the experience of suffering where only God can respond or speak to it. And he's Job on the ashes. There's a moment where, hey, the friends, stop talking. I need to have a chat with God right now. So what are we asked to do? The first thing to do is to assume what's already impacting us. The ecological crisis is not something that's coming to us. It's already there. Suffering is not something that possibly can happen to us. We're already suffering. Can we start by acknowledging our suffering? Then can we reclaim our agency within that suffering instead of always trying to keep or stay outside or at a distance from it, right? Because the medical ideal in our culture is to get rid of suffering and not having to suffer. You're going to be, prescribed something in order not to feel the pain. What if there was a need to actually feel some pain in order to be able to overcome whatever it is that's causing the pain, or to address whatever is going on? Then can we share the pain? Are we meant to live and experience pain by ourselves, alone? Or is there a way in which, or through which, pain actually brings us together, reconnecting us with our common human vulnerability and nature? And from there, we can gain a collective agency to do something about it, seek healing, and embrace something like a new self and a new world. Okay, I'm gonna try to get this to work. Short excerpt from Dune Part 1 about the meaning of life when you're in the midst of a sandstorm.
Isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. A process that cannot be understood by stopping it. We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it. We must flow.
interesting point to observe that by the end, Paul Atreides understands that he has to stop trying to control the ship through the storm and let the storm carry the ship wherever it needs to go without him controlling the movement. So, as Christians, as Catholics, the fundamental insight that we can add to what has already been said is the fact that suffering is something that God has chosen to partake in or of. It's not something that God wants to remain away from, but actually chooses to embrace and live in God's own person, embodied person. Even more interesting is the fact that the risen Christ is not a superheroic character, but he's wounded still. And he actually ministers with the help of his wounds, like Thomas needs to touch the wounds to finally believe. The wounds are not gone, they're still there. And they're a place from where Christ can actually teach or give new life and new faith and instill new hope. Holiness is not about becoming perfect, but it's about being able to love truly, right? The other as other. How do we learn to do that, including all the wounds and the bruises and the stuff that we don't know how to deal with at first? And finally, the idea that there might be some experiences of death that we need to undergo. Death to self, death to a certain way of being, of relating with one another, with creation, and even with God, in order to be able to rise again in a more healthy and faithful way. So what are the tasks before us? We need to listen to suffering, especially the silent forms, because the most intense form of suffering are those that are so deep that they prevent a voice of lament to be spoken. So there's more to suffering than the suffering that's still able to voice itself. How many or how much silent suffering do you see in your classroom every day? Then what character formation do we need to undergo in order to be able to detect, to notice that suffering, and then be present to it in a communally humanizing way? How do we move from silent suffering or turn from silence to transformative speech? Learning to speak from within suffering, instead of trying to impose a language of suffering or about suffering from outside. Because that's the tendency we have. We come with the solutions from outside, ready-made solutions, the toolbox that we bring in the class from outside. We already know what to do if there's a problem. Flipping that around, can we learn from those who suffer, from immersing ourselves within the community of the sufferers, what healing is needed, what form the healing should take? We're looking for a wounded wisdom, not a perfectly restored innocence. Right? The risen Christ, again, is wounded. To use the language of Pope Francis in Laudato Si', what we're talking about is allowing ourselves to be destabilized, moved away from our comfort zone, and then even allow ourselves to be transformed in the process, acknowledging that suffering will not leave us the same. If we authentically allow ourselves to be affected by what we experience, we're going to be changed. We have to embrace the fact that we're not going to be the same in every way, shape, or form. Then we take responsibility for all the things that we have become and done and said that are inadequate, inappropriate to a healthy way of being in relationship with creation. And we learn to be good stewards for creation. We want to move from, like Francis of Assisi, prime example used by Pope Francis, from inherited privilege to voluntary poverty or simplicity. St. Francis needed to meet with a leper to reckon with his own selfish, self-centered orientation that his privilege allowed him to cultivate and nurture. From there, he was able to learn from the marginalized, the oppressed, how to share common existence that's meaningful, and especially embraces creatureliness. Because what privilege allows people to do is to deny or forget that they're creatures and therefore inherently utterly dependent on others to be who they are. We need, as privileged individuals and communities, to reckon with our dependence and then become compassionate and empathetic towards ourselves and everybody and everything else. Lament is a way of giving language to pain and suffering, and we do it before God and our fellow human. In order to give voice to our pain, we first need to remember it, because we tend to forget what's difficult and challenging. Let's try to remember. From there, we put words on the pain we feel. And then we try to process it. We walk through it. We journey in the pain. And from there, we're able to be a bearing witness towards a possible reconciliation and make a communal profession of faith, right? In order to be faithful as wounded, we need to speak our pain to God in a way that's honest and humble. What's really interesting here is the quote on that slide. The deeper the grief, the closer God is. Remember, the Christian God saves by undergoing the passion. If we really want to prevent ourselves from suffering in any way, shape, or form, how much connection do we allow for ourselves to experience between ourselves and God, the Christian God? So, when we lament, we speak to God. That's another thing that we tend to avoid. We do a lot of talking, but how much of it is to God? And what do we say? We complain. We can speak our pain and all the things that are wrong and are go wrong. But we do it from a basis of trust. We believe and trust that God will hear and respond. And then we can make demands, our prayers of petitions, feeling assured that we will receive an expression of infinite mercy from the infinitely merciful God. And we praise and thank that God. And I conclude with an example of what today an ecological or an ecologically oriented lament could look like. This is a famous speech from Greta Thunberg. I can turn it on. There we go.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us? But, of course, we can still turn this around. It is entirely possible. It will take drastic annual emission cuts, unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone can deliver anything close to that, that means we will have to change. We can no longer let the people in power decide what is politically possible or not. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people.
Thank you.
Maybe you want to stay there for and see if there are a few questions, and I will pass the mic to Dr. Hincks. Are there any questions from here, from this in this room, people in this room?
This is not about some expensive, politically correct.
To the other slide area.
And then we will also gather comments and questions from the people who have joined us online. Any questions? Let's start here on in the room. Any questions to our speakers? Comments, observations? Agnes, yes, please.
Jean-Pierre, I was wondering if there...
Yeah, use the mic. Yeah.
I really took a lot of insight from your discussion about lament. In this context, when we're looking at developing ways of dealing with youth climate anxiety, are there ways currently for youth and teachers with youth and youth with other youth who aren't feeling climate anxiety to express lamentation in the education system?
That's a great question. I think a good starting point is not to be afraid of the eco-anxious responses from youth. What's scarier is when it's not there, I'd say. Because if you have actual expressions of eco-anxiety, it means that they're positively responding to what's going on, and they're able to express it, and it has an external manifestation. What's much more not only dangerous, but complex to address is when it's not even taking an expressible form at all, that you cannot even perceive it. You have to wait in the silence or, break through the shell or enable potential expression of it, right? So that you actually learn to teach, you have to learn to teach in a place where even eco-anxiety cannot be felt. So we may have to develop pedagogies that actually cultivate eco-anxiety instead of trying to get rid of it too quickly. Because we may not have reached the ability to fully feel it in the first place. And from there, we might be able to then address it as a full-blown articulate expression of our response to what is going on. So the first question would be, at least from my standpoint, is can everyone and has everyone gotten in touch with his or her potential eco-anxiety? And has he or she been able to find a way to articulate and express it, whatever form that needs to take for this or that person, and individually and also communally? I think we haven't reached a point where it's something that's fully expressed and that we're aware of and that we can responsibly own. From there, we can have a responsible response. A responsible agency presupposes responsible awareness of what we're going through in the first place. Can we say we have reached that? That's the thing I would definitely invite us to consider.
Well, thank you for that invitation. Any other questions? Also for Dr. Hincks. Looking at online. I have a question for you. I much enjoyed your presentation. And I just wondered from your experience when you work with scientists, is there openness to dialogue when it comes to being in conversation with theologians? Or do you also encounter conflict there? And that's on that end.
I think the whole spectrum. Most scientists are nerds. They want to do their science, and that's kind of what they're interested in. So it'd be more like over a beer after work that those kinds of dialogues occur. But I think most, at least in my experience, most scientists are pretty open-minded. They might not be religious themselves, but they're curious, and most of them are interested in talking, I would say. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Mine was all right, yeah.
No, thank you. That answers my question. Thank you for expanding on that. Thank you. So I think we are moving to the next speaker.
And this is a little bit more of the interactive, not that this was not interactive, but it was interactive in a more internal way in terms of our listening and pondering. So we are now going to listen to Sister Marianne Francalanza, who is an FCG, Faithful Companions of Jesus sister from Malta. She studied mathematics and physics at the University of Malta, and after completing her teacher training at St. Mary's, Strawberry Hill in London, she taught mathematics at Belrive FCE Catholic College in Liverpool, England. She holds an MA in Christian Theology from Heathrow Jesuit College in London and is currently pursuing a postgraduate diploma in eco-theology at Regis St. Michael's Faculty of Theology. In her work and ministry, Sister Marianne seeks to connect her interest in ecology, science, and a passion for education with the living of a religious life. Welcome, Marianne.
I'll do the technical bit first. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so it's lovely to be here with you. I am delighted to be invited to share some practice ideas, and this is not a comprehensive list in any way, but I hope that it will activate your creativity in creating ideas and thinking of things that we can do in our classrooms and in our schools to continue this conversation and to help our young people. So I'm going to first start immediately interactively by inviting you to grab a piece of paper, maybe the back of your handout, and just a pen or some kind of a writing implement, and reflect for a moment. What was the climate trigger for you? So by climate trigger, we mean the moment when you realized that there was an enormity and a seriousness about the environmental issue. Can you remember what that was? Can you remember maybe some feelings that were around for you at that time? Okay. So just to move us on, a key aspect in the connection is the connection with the natural world. So a key aspect for us to start to think about how to deal with eco-anxiety, how to be in this world is to really connect with nature. And I think we all know that part of the issue has been that we have lost that connection with nature. So nature has the ability to heal and energize, to lift our spirits, to really open our hearts to love. I think, you know, we don't talk about love enough, I think. So in your classrooms, in your school, to create opportunities for the students to see, to be, to touch the natural world. You know, things like gardening, like going out in nature, being aware of what's happening in the natural world, the phases of the moon, at the moment, all the springing up, all the little things growing, to point them out. My classroom was, I looked over a tree, was a rowan tree or mountain ash in Britain. And I used to always say to the children, look, there's a rowan, it's doing this at the moment, or it's doing that. Or look, it's lost all its leaves. Just kind of to connect with the natural world. These kind of can be things that are done as a matter of course. One of the things we do in Catholic schools is time for prayer. And, you know, I would like to suggest that we as staff and students in Catholic schools are called to a life of ecological holiness. Maybe we need to ponder what that means. So our time of prayer can involve praise for creation, using psalms, using the beautiful imagery of the natural world. And as Dr. Fortin has just told us, using laments, letting the sorrow, letting all of that come out in our time of prayer, allowing space for that. It doesn't all have to be praise and beauty. That has its place. But, you know, the reality is also a reality of extinction, of destruction. Involving rituals, you know, things where we move around and do something with our hands to commit ourselves to the work of creation, or to commit ourselves to repentance, or to commit ourselves to honoring a particular part of creation, blessing the earth, thanking the earth. And of course, we have a wealth of stories wrote from scripture and from the saints of people who have already interacted with nature and for whom nature has been a teacher. Another idea would be to make links with the liturgical year. You know, there are a million ways of connecting what is already part of our Catholic tradition with this ecological movement. So in Lent, the call for ecological conversion that comes straight from Laudato Si. In Easter, something about new life. Christmas, light coming out of darkness. What can that say to us about the motion from lament to a hopefulness? Using also the, you know, the Catholic faith is so touchy-feeling. We use water, we use light, we use candles, you know, to kind of connect those. Who made, you know, what are the bees like who might have made our candle, etc. And of course, the huge opportunity is the season of creation, which is in September, October, and, you know, to really mark it in our school, mark it simply in day-to-day bits, but also maybe as part of a big school community. How do we mark it? Taking moments of prayer, committing ourselves to change, and protesting as appropriate. One of the connections that I think is really important for our young people to make, and I think is a real source of connection for them with their daily lives, is to connect ecological injustice with social injustice. Make the connection of justice there. So the justice for people affected by the climate, whether that's drought, whether that's the extractivist industries, you know, to really connect that to the people and the earth and continue to make that one. Justice for creatures. You know, an idea would be to take a creature, any creature, you know, maybe the bird that's in our image there, or you know, the buffalo, I don't know, some creature that you fancy, and really look with the students about what is injustice for that creature? What does injustice for that creature look like? And how are we implicated in that? What do we do about it? And I think you know, this action is not just about creating an anxiety or a guilt, but it's that it is hopeful actions. It is all about, you know, being involved in an action that creates hope within us, that makes us feel that we are in fact not powerless, that we are able to do something. Connections with other people. You know, often in a school community, we kind of forget that the rest of the world exists, but get people involved, bring them in. The older people in parishes, they have a wisdom and a way of being with the young people that might just be really helpful and hopeful. Volunteers, maybe parents might want to be involved. People who could share skills with the young people, make connections with others. There's loads of ways to do that. Simple things, litter picking, such an easy thing to do, but it creates conversation and connection and community. And we spoke about acknowledging the feelings of eco-anxiety. It is really important for the students to know the facts, and they're learning those in science and geography, but it's equally important for them to acknowledge what it does to them, what it does inside of us. You know, and as has been said already, the normal response is anxiety and fear. This is not an easy thing that the world is facing at the moment. And it is also normal to rejoice and be happy at something beautiful like the spring, at the same time thinking it's a little bit too early. You know, that you have a feeling of anxiety and fear. Both, it is okay. This is the normal response to the place we find ourselves in. So find ways for the student to express this, and maybe not just talking, although talking is helpful. And I wonder, can the arts help us? You know, so many ways of expressing some of this. Painting, collage, photography, needlework, and drama, music. Now, what is it that we have access to in our schools, and we have experts in our schools that can help us to continue this conversation and this, you know, the way we deal with this situation for our students? Okay, I'm just going to give you a moment again. Literally half a minute, but I want, you know, I might have said things that you said, oh, we're already doing this in our school. Write those down. What are you already doing of this? There might have been something I've said that is new, or there might have been something that I've said that sparked off a new idea for you. Can we just take literally half a minute and write some of those reflections down? Okay. So this is the only slide, the only time in the presentation when I'm going to say, do not do this. Do not teach despair. There's no need for us to do that. It's not our way. It's not our religious tradition to teach despair. So while really facing the reality head on and not being afraid of it, it is after all the truth. But alongside it, also make sure that you're giving the good news stories, the opportunities for hopeful action. You know, share the good news stories about nature working with humans to bounce back. And those stories, there's loads of them in the book that I'm suggesting here, and there's more than this book. But this writer here, Erin Kelsey, has loads of examples how nature is helping us, bouncing back. And working, you know, we give a little and the earth gives a lot back to us. Good news stories about human beings, often from diverse parts of a spectrum, are coming together to do something beautiful together for justice for themselves and the earth. And share the good ideas, the creative solutions that abound. And we don't hear those on the news. So share all of those good news stories alongside the reality of the destruction and the pain that comes with that. I want to share with you a quote here about from Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you've not read that book, I think it's really worth reading. And she says, knowing that you love the earth changes you, activates you to defend and protect and celebrate. But when you feel that the earth loves you in return, that feeling transforms the relationship from a one-way street into a sacred bond. And when we realize that, you know, as she says, the earth loves us back, the earth wants to be with us in this kind of journey to healing, then something deeper happens within us. So just a few ideas and resources that are available to us. The first one is this. We've heard about it, Laudato Si. It's a fabulous document. How much are we using it? Have we just looked at it, used quotes from it, take parts of the prayers at the end and use them for our prayer? There are a myriad amount of resources online on Laudato Si. Use them. Keep saying to the young people, you know, the Pope has sent you a letter, and this is what it says. Speaking of letters, I'm not sure how aware people are of this film that was produced after Laudato Si called The Letter. Again, it's a really good resource to be used in classrooms. It talks about climate anxiety. It talks about the hope of working together. It brings together the voices of the young people, the voices of the poor, the voices of indigenous people, and the voice of nature through science. It's a really good resource, and it's available for free on that website. The Laudato Si Action Platform is a community of people from all around the world that are sharing good ideas of how they are responding to Laudato Si. Schools, there is a whole section for schools. Is your school enrolled? If your school isn't, maybe you can be the one to kind of instigate that and have access to all those resources, and the hope of being connected. You know, it's bigger than us. It's bigger than us in our school. It's bigger than us in this province, etc. You know, we're a global community, and these little actions help, which is exactly what Pope Francis says in Laudate Deum. Every little bit helps. And I just love this quote, because in Laudate Deum, really, the Pope is saying, you know, I wrote you a letter called Laudato Si, and you're not listening. Really, that's kind of what I take from it. But he says, there are no lasting changes without cultural changes, without the big structural changes that seem so huge and we feel so powerless in front of. But there are no cultural changes without personal changes. So it's really to emphasize that for ourselves and for our students, that it does make a difference that our school recycles, that our school, you know, doesn't allow bottled water, etc., etc., etc. It does make a difference. Another little idea is using the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which have links with so many subject areas in our schools, and is a resource that is not Catholic or Christian. It's the whole world community coming together, which again is also a hopeful thing. And Robin Wall Kimmerer speaks about a sacred bond with nature. So she's talking at a different level. And I think, you know, we know that this work is hard and it is emotionally difficult for us and for our students. So there is a need to cultivate and grow that interior life, that inner life of ecological holiness, as I said at the beginning. Larry Rasmussen says this: people of sacramental imagination and piety, and that really is us, cultivate critical virtues of humility, care, respect, and reverence. In a world that is itself an extraordinary stanza in the hymn of the universe, a world worthy of so much more than the ransacked storehouse modernity has made of it. Just take a few seconds to look at that again. We are invited to cultivate these virtues. And virtues aren't cultivated by talking or even doing. Often they're cultivated by taking time to reflect on what we're saying and what we're doing. So there's a real call there to cultivate the interior life. So how do we do that with young people? One suggestion is the world Community for Christian Meditation has done a really successful introduction of teaching meditation in school. And we know that meditation can help with anxiety, with fear, and it can create community. So this is another option. They have, again, a very good website and resources for students and young people on how to teach it in school. And just a little thing there, it's not just for the students. It's important that we create that interiority for ourselves as well, because you can only sustain this work for so long without anything coming in to give you life and to give you nourishment. So I really invite you to kind of do that as well. Reflect on, how am I nourishing myself as I continue this work of connecting the environmental crisis with my student and my million other jobs in school. So I just want us to take a moment now, not to share with ourselves just on a little piece of paper, but in the groups that you're in. So in a moment, the people online will be placed into groups for a short time. And, to share what you've been thinking about. What are you already doing? What have you done that's been great and what has been challenging? And what is new and hopeful that you're getting as this conversation continues? So if you have some ideas and some words of encouragement to comment, please do put them in the chat for everybody to see who's online. But people here in front of me, if there's somebody who would like to say something, make a comment, we've only got a little bit of time, but there might just be something that's really kind of speaking to you and you want to share it with everybody else.
And please use the mic that is on your table.
Thank you. Yes.
I think a really wonderful resource for teachers in schools that we don't think about is the environmental education associations that are in just about every state or province. And the National Association of Environmental Education actually has a spirituality affinity group. So we know that environmental educators, no matter whether in a faith or a secular situation, you'll see them teaching, whether you're in a National Park Service or some other, whatever modality, and you'll see them touching their hearts, because by the very nature of this kind of work, whether you express it in a divine way or not, nonetheless, the awe and wonder of it all actually comes through. And I think sometimes schools, and I don't work with a lot of schools yet or youth because of the nature of our parish, but in my work as an environmental educator, I know that often teachers are overwhelmed and they don't know how to even address this because they don't have the science in their backgrounds, perhaps. So sometimes making those partnerships with what you were talking about, and there are folks out there, there are professional associations, there's Project Learning Tree and Project Wild and so on and so forth that could, if folks can be helped to make those linkages, could really help a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And many of these organizations have ready-made resources for schools. Thank you. Yes, and actually you have got the last page of your handout is in fact a whole list of such organizations. So there are more to explore. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Would anyone online like to speak?
I can jump in.
Go for it.
Hi, thanks. So Steve O'Sullivan, Director of Education, PNC Catholic School Board. Thank you for the presentation tonight. And one good idea that we had actually came from our students a couple of years ago. And they came to the board with an idea of banning single-use plastic water bottles that our trustees actually took and baked into policy. So that became a practice now that we have at our Catholic Education Center and moving throughout our schools. So that was great that it really came from the ground up, from the voice of our students, and that's something that the legacy of that idea. It's a simple one, that's enshrined in policy now forever. So that's one good idea and an inspirational thing that came from our board.
Thank you. It's asking the students what it is they're passionate about and seeing what they come up with. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
We have a couple of comments in the chat as well. Someone said to remember the benefits and importance of meditation in our schools. Another person said an intentional focus on hope. Then we have, I think, another comment here from Teresa, who said, our Eco Club put Boomerang Friday in place. We collect recycling twice a week to learn about waste, and we will be planting native species plants in May.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I think we've run out of time, so thank you so much for all of that, and hopefully you've got loads of ideas to go and put into action now. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to take 2 minutes of your time to say a couple of thank yous before we wrap things up. First of all, I want to thank all of you who have attended, both here in person and in our online community. We very much appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of a very busy day and a very busy week at a very busy time of the year to spend some time talking with us about these important things. We very much appreciate that. I also want to thank Adam and Jean-Pierre and Marianne, our speakers, who have given us such rich things to think about. And if you'll join me in thanking them one more time. Importantly, I want to thank our hosts here at the Durham Catholic, Durham School Board. Sorry. Particularly Catherine Stevenson and Janice, who have helped us so much in getting this event together today. We very much appreciate their willingness to partner with us and to engage in this conversation with us. And a particular thank you to the IT department here at the board, without whom we would not have all of this. Thank you as well to all of the support people at RSM, and particularly to Gila for monitoring our online chat and Teams, and to Rosemary, who is the grad assistant with our project. I also want to give a shout out to Emil and Erica, who are sitting over there. They are from our recruitment office, and we would be delighted to talk with anybody who is interested in talking more about theology and ecology, or theology and anything else. Our upcoming conference on October 5th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., which will be in person at the University of St. Michael's College. We haven't actually booked a room yet, so we don't know specifically where, but somewhere on the St. Mike's campus. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Joyce Mercer, who is the Horace Bushnell Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care and the Associate Dean of Academics at Yale Divinity School. We are absolutely delighted that she is going to be coming to talk specifically about Christian faith responses to youth climate anxiety. We will also have some panels, including other RSM faculty, students, and friends. Lunch is included, and the whole conference is free because it's covered by our wonderful grant from the Association of Theological Schools. So the same link that you used to sign up for this event, you can use to sign up for that event. We will be sending out reminders when we get a little bit closer as well. So on behalf of myself and Hilda Koster and Rosemary Boissonneau, I want to thank you all for your participation today and for all of the rich conversation that we had. Thank you very much.